Okay, I'm sorry, that last video froze at the end there, so I'm starting a new part. What this means is that there's going to be two basic classes of people in society, according to Marx. There's going to be the capitalists, who are the ones who own the means of production. That is, they own whatever system it is that does this transformation of raw materials plus labor into a product, so that they're the ones who profit when they sell off these transformed goods, these products, right? They're the ones who spend money on labor and raw materials and get money from the product. The other class is going to be the wage laborers. They are the people who add the labor, and they don't own the means of production. They sell their labor in exchange for money so that the capitalists can use that labor in order to make money off of their product. So wage laborers are the ones who are going to be on a fixed salary or a fixed per piece pay schedule, and they are going to be providing labor but not owning the output. The capitalists will attach a price to what they do, and their money comes not from the product but from selling off their labor power. Now, like the product, wage labor is also going to be priced by way of supply and demand, right? The less that the labor costs, the more that the capitalists are going to profit from the products, because the less they need to spend on the labor they add to the raw materials. So they have a motive to pay wages as low as they can pay. But there's a certain point below which they can't drop, because if they pay wages that are too low, then either some other company is going to pay higher wages and they're going to lose their laborers, or they're going to pay such low wages that the laborers are going to die or become too unwell to be able to work, in which case they can't provide the labor anymore. So you need to pay wages that are high enough to keep the labor force going, even if just at a very minimum level, and high enough to compete with other capitalists, but no higher. There's a built-in incentive to keep the wages as low as possible within those two constraints. It's important to note that for Marx, and it seems to me that he's clearly right about this, none of this has anything to do with people's intentions. It's not that you have evil capitalists who are trying to exploit wage laborers and are trying to harm them. It's just built into the capitalist system that companies need to make a profit in order to survive, and the way that they can make a profit is by minimizing labor costs. Okay, so the amount of profit is going to be the difference between how much the product can be sold for versus how much the capitalist spends on materials and labor. And so the lower the labor costs and the lower the material costs, the higher the profit. This means that the capitalist has a motive to keep wages as low as can be done without losing its labor force, but it also means, and this is really important for us, that capitalists have a motive to arrange their companies and their production systems so as to minimize their labor needs. And what does this mean? Well, for one thing, it means minimizing the special training that laborers need in order to do their job that makes them more expensive. How can you minimize the special training that laborers need? Well, one really important technique is through what Marx calls increased differentiated labor. The idea is this: you make your company larger and larger and the system of labor inside it more and more complex, so that the job that people have becomes a smaller and smaller slice of a larger and larger system. So you get the complexity by networking together different people's jobs rather than by any one person doing a complex job. This is just more efficient, right? If you have tons of people, each of them doing a small job that requires very little training that can be done very easily, and you network them together in a larger whole in order to produce something on a very huge scale, then that's going to be cheaper than having specialized laborers who are each doing a very complicated job and are responsible for a lot, right? This is why there's an internal pressure for what White Whale calls vertical integration, for companies to become larger and larger and bigger in scope and to own more and more steps in the process, while in the meantime, each laborer is doing a tinier and simpler job, right? So, for example, think about bureaucratic jobs where the role that somebody has in a bureaucracy is very tiny. And their role is to send paper, to check some kind of file for having some property and send it on to somebody else. And all day long, that's what they do. They check files for some number or property, and then they send the file to somebody else. Their own job is nearly meaningless, but you put together all their jobs and you get an overall complex system. Or think about the person who works in a toothpaste factory, and his job is just to check to make sure that the little piece of foil over the top of the toothpaste is secure. And all day long, from morning till night, he checks toothpaste foils. This is a meaningless job in and of itself. It's a part of a much larger whole. It requires almost no training, but he is able to do this job very cheaply, and it knits together with other jobs in order to create a large production system. So capitalists have a motive to make their companies bigger and their jobs smaller and easier, because highly trained workers are more expensive because you need to be able to pay them enough to get through their training. They enter the workforce later and so forth. Okay, so that's one technique, differentiation and large scope. The other technique for keeping labor costs low is automation through machines, right? Offloading complex labor onto complex machines instead. This was a big deal for Marx because he was writing right after the Industrial Revolution when we saw this kind of automation for the first time. We saw people's jobs being replaced by machines in factories. But it's also a big deal right now, right? We're in an era where artificial intelligence is taking over and automating a lot of jobs, especially right this second during the coronavirus crisis, where we see a lot of former social functions that had to be done by people who had meaningful social jobs moving online, right? This is having a huge impact on the service and sales industry, where a lot of jobs that were done by people are now being done through online portals that don't involve one-on-one interactions. So to sum up again, the ways that labor costs can be kept down are by increasing scale, making the job that needs to be done smaller and more differentiated, and automation. All of these forces together are going to produce what Marx calls alienation. I'm going to break here so this video doesn't get too long, and we'll talk about alienation in just a second.